Welcome everybody to a new video. Today I'm very happy to have on Laura Vander Vos. Super excited for this episode, and we're going to be talking about sacred music today, and music in the context of the Mass. And Laura, if you could, maybe you could just introduce yourself a little bit and tell us who you are and how you got into music.
Absolutely, yeah. My family's been in liturgical music ever since I can remember. And so I grew up with that thinking, I can't wait until I'm old enough to be singing for Mass. And so I started when I was 14. So I've got about almost 16 years of experience with liturgical music. And we kind of sang just whatever was trendy at the time, for a long time, because we didn't even encounter sacred music principles until I'd already been doing music for a little while.
Okay.
And we used to sing for the Spanish masses at my parish. So, like really lively music and, drums and all kinds of things. So yes, it's been quite a journey. And
Yes.
then finding out that there were sacred music documents in the church, like legislation and stuff, are like, wow, we didn't even know that was a thing, because most of the time
Right.
people don't even talk about it. So
Yeah.
reading those was a big education and really transformed the way we thought. Then we had a choir director go to one of the CMAAs, that's the Church Music Association of America, and they
Okay.
put on these awesome workshops and chant intensives. And so he went to one of those for like a week, and he came back with all the stuff to share with us. So he got us ready to sing all the Latin propers for Holy Week one year, and we learned it in like a month, and we sang it, and we were like, oh, that was kind of cool. And I wasn't totally hooked on chant. I was like, I mean, intellectually I know it's a great thing, but I thought it was kind of boring. My sister and my mom were like, yes, this is the best. And so I was like, whatever, but if it's what the church wants, I'll sing it. And then the more I sang it, the more it just kind of changed me. And I was like, this is really cool. Like, and it wasn't about my preference anymore, or, oh, I love this song because I grew up with it. It's like, well, yeah, those songs are still valuable to, whatever degree they serve your devotional needs. But within the Mass, I became aware of then why any old music doesn't just belong in the liturgy itself.
Right.
So that was really an eye-opening thing. So yeah, I've studied chant. I've gone to a few different music intensives that the CMAs hosted, where you have conductors from all over the world come and you sing like 5 hours a day, Mass every day that you sing for. They'll do like an extraordinary form one day, ordinary form the next, and for a whole week. And it's exhausting and it's wonderful. They have lectures, they have all this stuff. So you go home so jammed with stuff, you're just like, I can't believe it. Like, wow. But you're so excited because they give you all the tools to go home and do what you need to do in your parish to make sacred music really happen, to help your priest sing the Mass and all these things. And so then after that, I ended up coming up with the Gregorian chant workshop. One of my pastors had asked me to do that. And so I did it at a few different parishes in our diocese. And then I thought, well, why don't I put this on my YouTube channel? So I put that on there, and that's how you found me.
Yes.
That series, which I just lately finished, finally.
I saw. Yes, you posted the last two.
Yeah.
So. Yeah. So I found Laura through her YouTube channel, which, by the way, is Miss Happy Catholic. And I watched your playlist called Sacred Music. Is that what it's called?
I think it's like Sacred Music and Gregorian Chant for Beginners. And series.
Yeah, and I just binge watched them, and I was like, this is awesome. More people need to hear about this. So maybe to start with, you can just tell me, is there a difference? Well, obviously there's a difference, but what's the difference between sacred and profane, and then music that's sacred music and music that's just religious music? Is there a difference?
Yeah, and that's a big question. Those are excellent questions, but I'll do the short one first. So the words sacred and profane, like profane sounds like, you're talking about this bad thing. When it's used in the church documents, they're talking about anything that comes from outside the temple. Basically, profanus is the Latin for unholy, unconsecrated. So it's like secular, whatever's, out there in the world, but it's not necessarily for church use. Then there's sacer, the Latin word from which we get sacred. That means set apart or, restricted. It's like special. And so that's what sacred is, set aside just for the liturgy and use in the church. And so that's what those terms mean. And then,
Yeah.
yeah, you have this nuance between, sacred music and religious music, which takes people a little bit to get a handle on. But I found this awesome quote years ago by Bishop Thomas Olmsted. He used to be the Bishop of Phoenix, Arizona, until very recently. And he wrote beautifully about sacred music. So if I can do some quotes here, this was like my big answer, because this is a big question that people really need to get straight, I feel like,
I
to get
agree. Yeah.
into this. Okay, so Bishop Olmsted says, this was from 2012. Religious music is, we might say, the earthly expression of a given culture's faith in Christ. Liturgical music is the sacramental expression of Christ and the true nature of the church. The former, religious music, tends to be particular, individual, temporal, and profane. The latter tends to be universal, communal, eternal, and sacred. Religious music comes from human hearts yearning for God. Liturgical music comes from Christ's heart, the heart of the church longing for us. Because religious music is marked by the particular and profane, it is especially useful for evangelization. Like St. Francis Xavier donning the silk garments of Japanese nobility in his missionary work in Japan, religious music wears the clothes of those it seeks to evangelize. It becomes familiar, taking in much of the cultural forms, and where possible, doing this with minimal alteration. In religious music, the church learns to sing in many voices through the familiar melodies and rhythms of various cultures. But in the sacred liturgy, we enter the precincts not of man's culture, but the heavenly courts of Christ, the culture of the church, the wedding feast of the Lamb, and new festive garments are required for this feast. In liturgical music, the peoples drawn into the sacred liturgy learn to sing in one voice through the often unfamiliar melody and rhythm of the church's sacred music. This oneness is exemplified for us Roman Rite Catholics, primarily in Gregorian chant and polyphony, the musical garments of the texts of the sacred liturgy. And that's the end of his quote. So I just loved, that was a really great summary, but there's some other things we can bring into, like the Congregation for Divine Worship in 1987, they had a document that said the definition of sacred or religious music depends explicitly on the original intended use of the musical pieces or songs, and likewise on their content. You'd see that with like Schubert's Ave Maria, which you hear at Mass and funerals and stuff a lot, but it actually wasn't written for the Ave Maria. It was like from an opera with totally different text. And then it was later adapted to the words of the Ave Maria. So most people have only heard that. They assume it's a sacred piece, but it's not. And yeah, and that style that it's written in was not, it was like a theatrical style. So it was never born, into the liturgy like that. And so when I'm requested to sing that at funerals, I do it as a prelude, because I don't just want to jam it in the Mass if it's not really, ritually worthy of that.
Sure.
Professor William Mart is the president of the CMAA that I mentioned before, and he's a brain. He has some great videos on YouTube, especially one called "What Makes Music Sacred." And and I can give you links to some of these things that I reference if you want to share them in your video description later, because people can follow him. But yeah, he's excellent and very experienced. He's old and sweet and humble as can be. He's just so virtuous. And that's another thing, when you start mixing with these people, like these men that never got married because they're just celibate. They dedicate their lives to sacred music and promoting it and educating people about it and providing it for their parishes. And they're amazing, but like the personal holiness of them really shines through, and it just makes everything that they say and do so much more significant, which is what the church wants of her liturgical musicians. So he made some points in that talk, What Makes Music Sacred, that just kind of basically, like, the secular cannot dominate the sacred realm. The sacred should transform the secular. And then he gave examples of secular melodies from centuries ago that composers did incorporate into sacred works and how that was done. And it wasn't a matter of just baptizing a thing and saying it's suddenly fit for divine worship. I mean, it literally underwent a transformation before it was allowed into the Mass, and no one hearing it, even if they recognize the secular element, would take it in any other way than as a sacred piece, not a new creation. So it began as one thing, which inspired a new creation fit to glorify God. And that's how something secular can become sacred. And then another point that he made that was just so awesome is that sacred music in its inherent beauty pertains to the salvation of souls by leading them more closely and easily to the love of God. So that's another reason to do that well, because if you don't do that well, people are going to miss that whole opportunity they could have had to experience that within the Mass and be led to God. So it's a really big responsibility if you're going to be a liturgical musician,
Yeah.
that you understand the gravity of what you're doing.
Right. Beauty is a transcendental, so yeah, it
Yeah,
should lead us to God. Yeah.
absolutely. So
Right.
then there was just a little bit more. I mean, another thing that comes out a lot in the documents is personal preference must be abandoned when it comes to liturgical and sacred music, which is hard because music is such an emotional thing. And especially for people who've been doing it for years one way, and then they kind of
Right.
encounter this new information, they're like, oh my gosh, like what about my piano? What about this or that? Is that not okay? And
Yeah.
and so it can be a little rugged, but it's all going to work out. I mean, if you
Yeah.
really surrender yourself to that expression of worship, it transforms you. You're not going to be resentful.
Right.
It's not going to hurt you in any way or deprive you. So I
Yeah.
just want to put that out there for people because sometimes they get a little worried.
Right.
Pope John Paul II had a general audience in 2003 where he called on musicians to, quote, make an examination of conscience so that the
Hmm.
beauty of music and hymnody will return once again to the liturgy. They should purify worship from ugliness of style, from distasteful forms of expression, from uninspired musical texts, which are not worthy of the great act that is being celebrated.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, he wrote, it's like every pope writes on this because sacred music is a really big deal and they have a lot of excellent things to say. So you're definitely not wasting your time digging into this. He had a chirograph that he wrote 100 years after Pope Pius X's big encyclical on sacred music to kind of commemorate it. And in
Mhm.
there, John Paul II said, contemporary compositions often use a diversity of musical forms that have a certain dignity of their own. To the extent that they are helpful to the prayer of the church, they can prove a precious enrichment. Care must be taken, however, to ensure that instruments are suitable for sacred use, that they are fitting for the dignity of the church, and can accompany the singing of the faithful and serve to edify them.
Oh,
And then
yeah.
Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger also had a quote from the Spirit of the Liturgy where he said, on the
Mm.
one hand, there is pop music aimed at the phenomenon of the masses. It is industrially produced and ultimately has to be described as a cult of the banal.
Hmm.
Rock, on the other hand, is the expression of elemental passions, and at rock festivals, it assumes a cultic character, a form of worship, in fact, in opposition to Christian worship.
Hmm.
And so that, yeah, you can see how that's really incompatible with Catholicism at all, let
Yeah.
alone liturgical music. But some people would, try to argue differently.
Right.
Some general principles in church documents regarding the use of sacred music at Mass, like Sacrosanctum Concilium from Vatican II said, sacred music is for the glory of God and the
Mhm.
sanctification and edification of the faithful. And sacred music should consequently possess in the highest degree the qualities proper to the liturgy, and in particular, sanctity and goodness of form. That's from Pope Pius X's encyclical, which we'll go over later about like what are the three qualities of sacred music that it has to possess.
Right.
Mhm. And
Okay.
yeah, so there's it's no, this one's good too. The introduction into the celebration of anything that is merely secular or which is hardly compatible with divine worship under the guise of solemnity should be carefully avoided.
Hmm.
That's an interesting, thing to say. Yeah,
Oh,
instruments that are generally associated and used only with worldly music are to be absolutely barred from liturgical services and religious devotions. And Gregorian chant always should be given pride of place in liturgical services. That's all over the place.
right.
And yeah, so it says that music should grow organically from forms already existing. And they get into that later. It's like chant is the standard for the Roman Rite and liturgical worship music. And the closer something approaches to chant, the more fit for the temple it becomes. The farther it departs from it, the less worthy it is. And that's
Hmm.
from Pope Pius X's encyclical from 1903 on
Yeah.
sacred music, and when he talks about the qualities of music and things. But yeah,
Yeah.
we can go on and on.
Seriously, this is like a gold mine, though. I mean, that what was that document from Pope John Paul II that you
It's
quoted
it's
from?
called a chirograph, which I don't
Okay.
really know what that means, but it was from 2003 on sacred music, commemorating the 100th anniversary of Pope Pius X's Tra le Sollecitudini was the name of his from 1903. That's still, it's referenced in every single musical document that I've ever read that's come out since then. So it's still upheld as the standard, like
Right.
discerning about sacred music.
Yeah, I have not read that. I've read some of John Paul's letter to artists from 1999, but I haven't read that. And then I got into Ratzinger's The Spirit of the Liturgy a little bit, but
Yeah.
it's a beast. It's a long one, if I
Yeah.
remember right. But yeah, really good stuff. I One of the things that I picked up on that you mentioned in one of those quotes was about this idea of sacred music being pertaining to the realm of the eternal, and religious music pertaining to the realm of the temporal. And
Mhm.
this is a really interesting thing to me because if you think about the way that the Jews viewed the Holy of Holies in the first temple, this was the realm like outside of time. Like going into the Holy of Holies, you were entering the realm of the eternal.
Mhm.
And there is something about this like element of timelessness in the mass, whether whether it's architecture or iconography or music. I feel like there
Mhm.
should be a feeling of timelessness when you come to church, when you come to the mass.
Yeah.
Like I don't
Definitely.
want to feel like I'm going to church and I feel like, okay, I'm in the 80s, or I don't want to. I just,
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
definitely. Yeah,
So
absolutely. No, it's, I mean, that's your question, or what you were kind of getting to about, shouldn't we be encountering the transcendent when we come to mass? That's bang on. I mean, it absolutely matters. And that's why chant, having no regular meter or consistent rhythm, it doesn't evoke the strong sense of the passing of time like modern music does. And it makes it
right.
the perfect accompaniment to the sacred action, because it does,
Mm,
it pulls you out of time. And if you've ever been at a, awesome liturgy where there's just, yeah, chant and polyphony like all over, and it's just rich and full, and you're like, I don't even know how much time is passing. I've walked out of masses like that, and it's like 2.5 hours have gone by and I couldn't tell, because yeah, I was just in another place. So
yeah,
it's a thing.
that's yeah, that's a really good point about it being pulled out of the rhythmic. How did you put it? Like the way that regular music
Yeah, the
is.
meter and the rhythm, like, yeah,
Yeah,
because chant is free form. There's no time signatures.
right.
It's not bound in like that. So it's supposed to just be music to express the text.
Yeah,
That's why it exists. And so it's about the text, not about the music itself. Although the
yeah.
music kind of raises it to another level and impacts you more.
Sure. Yeah. There's so many things I could go off of what you said. Another thing that was really interesting was you mentioned the holiness of the musicians being important. And this reminds me of how in the East, especially in times past, there used to be a lot more emphasis on uh, the holiness of like the person doing the sacred art. Like the iconographers were expected to be, they were expected to almost like profess the vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. Like they were really held to a high moral standard. And
Mhm.
I'm not sure if it's the same, today, but I think there is something really awesome about that idea of artists and musicians being held to a higher moral standard.
Oh,
Um,
yeah, absolutely. I mean, because there's something in here. I think I got out of my, oh yeah, because you had mentioned in the outline you sent me ahead of time. Haha, I know we're cheating here, aren't we? I'm guessing that we had, but this is how I could try to look impressive, because then I could be prepared. But you had a question there about like the similarity with what we're talking about, sacred versus religious music, and the distinction between sacred art and like icons, versus just religious art. And it's
right.
true, because you can't just slap any old picture of Jesus and Mary up in a church and bam, it's worthy of being in there. I mean,
Yeah.
I thought that was really interesting. So I went and did some digging to answer that question. And Pope Pius XII, in his document Musicae Sacrae, he said some really interesting things. He said sacred music obeys laws and rules which are no different from those prescribed for all religious art, and indeed for art in general.
Mm,
And then he goes on, now we are aware of the fact that during recent years, some artists gravely offending against Christian piety have dared to bring into churches works devoid of any religious inspiration and completely at variance with the right rules of art. They try to justify this deplorable conduct by plausible looking arguments which they claim are based on the nature and character of art itself. They go on to say that artistic inspiration is free and that it is wrong to impose upon it laws and standards extraneous to art, whether they are religious or moral, since such rules seriously hurt the dignity of art and place bonds and shackles on the activity of an inspired artist.
yeah,
And
yeah,
he goes on to say that this issue should be resolved by examining man's final end and considering that everything we do should lead us more directly to that. So, sacred art is a powerful means to lead souls to God. and shouldn't be taken lightly as something crafted merely for its own sake, he says, or according to the preference of the artist. So basically, artists are
Yes.
given a gift that's meant to help them and others approach God more closely and achieve their final end, which is heaven. And if that is neglected, they're betraying the gift from God. And then he talks about the freedom of the artist is not a blind instinct to act in accordance with his own whim or some desire for novelty. It is in no way restricted or destroyed, but actually ennobled and perfected when it is made subject to the divine law. And he says that those whose lives are unworthy or impious should not even attempt to craft sacred art or music, because their lack of sincerity and virtue will show through and result in something unfit for the worship of God.
Oh,
Yeah.
amen. Yeah. There's this, I wish I had written it down because I can't remember it exactly, but Pope John Paul II, he had this quote in one of his documents that he was talking about sacred art, and he said that it needs to be able to bear the weight of the mystery of the ages. And I always think about that when I see some of these, like, modern churches and stuff, and it's like, man, that's gonna go out of style real quick. Like,
Oh, yeah.
Chesterton said, if you marry the times, you'll soon be a widow, or something. Like, it's just a bad idea, you know.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, I mean, and that really extends to, I mean, it's not just the religious art that's up on the walls. I mean, when you're talking about that whole environment in the church, like you said, the architecture or the decorations, and it's like, and the music and incense and all these things, vestments, because it's all part of the art and the scene. And yeah, what kind of an environment are you creating? Are you trying to make it feel like your living room, or like a gym, or like
a coffee shop?
Yeah, right. I know, you got to start from the bones and work your way up and just look at everything and be like, is this worthy? Is this worthy? And it's really intense, but it's really from which everything else flows that we do as Catholics. So I know it's hard, especially for priests, because they have so much administrative responsibility and ministries and council meetings and all these things, but it's like, whenever I get a chance, I just encourage them to focus their prime efforts on the liturgy, because that will flow out and bless everything else that you do. Once you get that right, you can get everything else right.
Yeah. No, it's powerful. I mean, it was hearing a choir in a Catholic church that first, like, it shook me before I became Catholic. That was one of the things that really was a big eye-opening experience for me. It was just the beauty, really, just
Wow.
But yeah, I was gonna say something and I totally lost it. So maybe I'll go into another question. So you talked a little bit about instruments and how certain instruments are pretty much only used in secular music, and like, what types of instruments are suitable and most suitable in the setting of the mass?
Well, the organ has been the principal instrument approved for the liturgy for centuries. And it used to not, I mean, obviously the organ wasn't around forever, so it was just the human voice. The early church was very skeptical about using instruments at all, because they were so commonly used in pagan worship, and probably most instruments at the time were. So they were like, well, which ones of those could we incorporate without just bringing that flavor in? And it was like, that's one thing that Chesterton, in his biography of St. Francis of Assisi, he has a really interesting point about how that first 1,000 years had to kind of wash the world clean of paganism, so that St. Francis comes on it like a springtime, like a new birth. He's able to call, the sun, brother, sun and sister moon and all these things like that. Before that point, and early monasticism had helped to kind of make things more austere, and like, it's like it had to really die out. And then he could bring in all these things that's like, they were always good, but they were understood in a pagan context before. But that finally left the scene, and then it could be kind of reborn. And so that happened with instruments, and it kind of happened with the organ first. I think what was it, like the 600s was like the first time an organ was introduced into a church. Pope Vitalian, I think, was the one who brought that in. And some people were kind of like, whoa, any kind of instrument, this is kind of edgy, so it took a while to get established, but it's been a standard for so long that it's just accepted that that's, it is now a sacred instrument primarily. Like, other people will use it, but you hear an organ and it makes you think of church. you
Yeah,
know? So, but you hear a piano and you're like, you'll think of lots of things, but not necessarily of church. And there's a
sure.
really interesting article on Catholic World Report that I can give you the link to. It's called "Is the Organ Really a Sacred Instrument?" So it talks about the whole history of the organ thing and why the organ is distinct as a sacred instrument, but then it also contrasts it with the piano because like that's been used for decades, and some people are hopeful that that will eventually become, will constitute a sacred instrument, but they make the argument in there why that probably will never happen. And Pope Pius X in his encyclical actually said pianos are forbidden. So that's never actually been abrogated. It really hasn't. I mean, a piano is a percussion instrument, and
That's
even
right.
though documents that talked about sacred music, they allowed finally for wind instruments and stringed instruments as being especially capable of evoking the sentiments of the human heart and adding to the worship of God. They never ever talk about percussion instruments as being
Yeah,
something recommended, and
right,
Pope Pius X was down on those too, so that would encompass the piano as well. It's just
right.
in church, but it's not like it ever was supposed to be.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's just a lot of people and who are unaware, and priests who maybe haven't had the formation that they should have or could have had, and so they're just unaware, maybe.
Hmm.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
I know there's just so much to cover. And priests' liturgical formation has been kind of lacking since the council. I would say generally, not everywhere, but at
Sure.
least, yeah, in my experience, that's not something that gets a ton of attention. And it's getting better though, like steadily, it's
Right.
improving. And the priests themselves are like, the seminarians are like, I want to know about this and I want to do a good job. So they're fervent to, really get that down and apply themselves, which is really good to see.
Yeah, I feel like with art and architecture and all these things that we're talking about, and I feel like it is trending up. It's getting better slowly
Mhm.
but surely. People are becoming more aware of like, wait, what were we doing, a few decades ago? And
Yeah.
yeah, um, yeah,
Yeah, it's encouraging for sure.
it is very encouraging to see that. I read a book by Sister Gianna Vissel called Icons in the Western Tradition or something like that. And she talks about sort of the return of iconography
Mhm.
um, because it's becoming kind of popular again and people are
Yeah.
remembering this, this ancient art form that's very Christian in its roots. And yeah, just the return to certain elements of tradition and, what we were talking about earlier about the church looking like a coffee shop or like whatever. Like we have the coffee shops and we have the all the hip places outside the church, and I think
Mhm.
sometimes we think that we need to make it relevant or we need to make it look up to date
Mhm.
and to attract the youth, And
Yeah.
I just don't think it's true. I mean, I think there's room for um, I think the style and architecture has changed throughout the centuries. There
Mhm.
it's gone from classic, and then there was Gothic, and there was different styles, but it's kept certain elements, like certain
Yeah.
key components that make a church building. Um,
Right.
and yeah, I just think that what people actually really want is something timeless, something sacred.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah, we need a break from all that stuff. Like you say, it's everywhere. But it was supposed to not be in church. That's supposed to be a separate place where it's a sanctuary. It's called that for a reason. It's a
yeah,
refuge from the rest of the world. But I know you had asked me about why do we have a hard time understanding what sacred means anymore? And it's like, I mean, our melting pot cultural experiences, and everybody's talking about celebrating diversity and stuff, but it kind of almost has the opposite effect. It's like it just sort of soups everything together, and then it's all just kind of like blah because it's all around you all the time. And it doesn't, it's like we lose the sense of varying degrees of solemnity, office, place, and
yeah,
people that we encounter, and everyone wants everybody to be so comfortable and not threatened or anything, so they just throw out all these distinctions, but it's like, well, that wasn't really good in the church. I mean, I'm not promoting clericalism at all or anything like that, but it's like you do have to acknowledge when certain things are special or not intended for every use. But I mean, yeah, what is set apart these days? That's kind of, it's like
hmm
negative things, jail and dumps and junkyards and, cemeteries for the dead, like all these things. That's like, ooh, like if it's a negative consequence or subject, yeah, it's kind of set apart. You avoid germs and you avoid difficult people and things like that. But what is that idea of saving something that's special for a sacred purpose? And like I used as an example in my workshop videos, it was like a wedding dress. Everybody
Hmm.
gets that a bride is going to wear something special for her wedding. They don't have a problem with it. They're like, well, of course. And you're not going to just go wear your wedding dress every day of the week because
Right.
it would be odd. And it's like, it's significant and it's special and you take care of it and you treasure it. You might pass it down for generations. It's like that's something beautiful and good that is still set apart, even outside the Catholic world. And so that's kind of the idea with this. And it's like the wedding feast of the Lamb happens at every mass. So
Yeah.
it makes sense that you need special garments and trappings and things. And then you get those people that are like, well, why are we giving all this attention to these things? It's just superficial, or it's so
Yeah.
expensive. We could give that money to the poor, and you're like, oh,
Yeah.
don't say that. Like, I know who said that first. But yeah, it's
Yeah.
like if
Right.
if that happens to someone where they really feel like that, it's like something has damaged their sense of wonder.
Yeah.
And why that is, it's necessary to understand like God is always special. And of course we should bring our best and we should be happy to donate and work our fingers to the bone for these things that people did for centuries. They built cathedrals that took hundreds of years to make, and they were
Yeah.
proud to be part of that. And those
Hmm.
things still stand and they're still being used, and it's like, what a testament to those people's faith and their love of God. It wasn't a waste, absolutely not. It's
No.
like treasure in heaven.
Yeah.
And God's not gonna, be like, oh yeah, I'm just taking all your money for the liturgy and stuff, and then all the poor people are gonna starve. It's like, no, He's a God of abundance. We got to think like that.
Yeah. Oh man, I know. I've been talking to a number of people who seem to have like lost. Uh, they don't understand what the point is of the
Ah,
iconography or the sacred in and it's just it makes me really sad. One of the things Jonathan Peugeot talks about is that like we need to have our priorities in order, and there needs to be like this proper hierarchy to our priorities. Like if your church
mhm.
building, if your house looks nicer than your church, then things are like out of order. The church should be like
Yeah.
at the top of the mountain. It's like it's central, and that's why in Europe at least you have the cities built around the tallest building, the church. Now it's maybe not the
Mhm.
church, but it used to be. And there
Yeah.
was this idea of the centrality, literally, physically, and also like spiritually, in the lives of the people.
Mhm.
And uh,
Yeah.
you mentioned the wedding dress, which is interesting because one of the things I think that you tell me what you think, but I feel like we don't understand the idea of solemnity anymore. The
Mhm.
solemn. Uh, People hear that word now and they think sad, like
Yeah.
down, funeral. I don't know,
Yeah.
but and C.S. Lewis has really another quote I should have written down. He has a fantastic explication of what solemn and solemnity actually means, and he gives the
Mm.
example of a bride walking down the aisle. Right?
Oh
Does
yeah.
she like sprint down the aisle? Does she skip down the aisle? No, she
Yeah.
walks, and she walks slowly. She's savoring every second.
Yeah.
Is it because she's so sad? No, of course not. Nobody thinks that, you know? But we all, like, instinctively recognize that that is right and just for the moment. The bride should walk
Yeah.
down, like, dignified and slowly, and
Mhm.
it's ceremonial, right? And
Yeah, right. That's the word. I literally just read that quote of C.S. Lewis because I was reading Elizabeth Elliot's "Let Me Be a Woman," and she talks about that there. And I was like, and I bookmarked it because I thought that's awesome. I should use that for something because that's so cool. No, it was great. He puts things so well.
yeah, yeah. I thought it was, it was a good point because I do feel like we don't that's another thing we don't, we need to retrieve, we need to recall that
Yeah.
sense of the sacred, the solemn, and the ceremonial. Like I think we will ceremonialize things. We can't get away from it. We can't escape it. We ceremonialize birthdays or gift giving, or
Yeah.
uh, you know, we're going to have ceremony because we need to. Again, it's like hierarchy. Everything can't be the same. You mentioned celebrating diversity, and it just becomes this like muddy sludge. And it's like, I think the key to like I don't know, let's say unity, whether we're talking denominationally or whatever, is
Mhm.
for every color to be fully itself and as vibrantly itself as it can be, because if you just mush all the colors together, you get like a weird, ugly brown color. And
Yeah,
so,
that's
I
a
don't
good
know.
analogy.
I'm
Yeah.
going on a tangent, but
No, it's good. It's right. Well, everything in its place, and then it can still be appreciated and preserved. It's not going to
right.
just get all watered down.
Yes, you give the example in one of your videos of pepper, and it's like pepper is great on eggs, but it's not so good on in tea, I think you said.
Yeah.
So yes. So so what about, do you have any thoughts on Judaism and the Jews and how maybe chant or music or any of this relates to that?
Yeah, actually, I went and did some digging on that too because I'd heard for a long time, that the roots of chant are in Judaism, and I was like, well, that makes sense. I mean, the thing is, oh, there's this guy, Dustin Quick. He has this YouTube channel called Cigars. Oh, holy smoke, Cigars, Catholicism, and Conversation, and he started that channel because he wanted to talk about like First Temple theology and help people understand the Jewish roots of their Catholicism and why basically Catholicism has been, it's not like, well, we went along and then Jesus came and then there was the Catholic Church. It's like, it's the logical continuation of Judaism. It's the same faith. It's
Yeah.
just that there's more revelation to fill it out. So it's like, oh, everything just follows naturally into it. And
Yep.
so, of course, the sacred music would have done the same thing because in the temple, way back, they were singing the Psalms and that was their prayer, their sacred prayer. And those melodies are just passed down orally for centuries, even after our Lord came. So he would have sung them with the disciples, and the early Christians would have been singing them. And they do talk about, them singing antiphonally, the Psalms and stuff when they come together to have their Sunday mass and stuff in the early Christian writings about the liturgy. So that's definitely a big feature of those. And it carried on, from there. But I found this interesting quote from Joseph Fessio. Father Joseph Fessio wrote a book called The Mass of Vatican II, and he tells this little story in there. He says, the Psalms are songs. Every one of the 150 Psalms is meant to be sung and was sung by the Jews. When this thought came to me, I immediately called a friend, a rabbi in San Francisco who runs the Hebrew school, and I asked, do you sing the Psalms at your synagogue? Well, no, we recite them, he said. Do you know what they sounded like when they were sung in the Old Testament times, in the time of Jesus and the apostles? I asked. He said, no, but why don't you call this company in upstate New York? They publish Hebrew music and they may know. So I called the company and they said, we don't know, call 1-800-Judaism. So I did. And I got an information center for Jewish traditions, and they didn't know either. But they said, you call this music teacher in Manhattan, he will know. So I called this wonderful rabbi in Manhattan, and we had a long conversation. At the end, I said, I want to bring some focus to this. Can you give me any idea what it sounded like when Jesus and his apostles sang the Psalms? He said, of course, Father. It sounded like Gregorian chant. You got it from us. I was amazed. I called Professor William Mart, who I mentioned, we're a professor of music at Stanford University, and a friend. I said, Bill, is this true? He said, yes, the psalm tones have their roots in ancient Jewish hymnody and psalmody. So you know something? If you sing the Psalms at Mass with the Gregorian tones, you are as close as you can get to praying with Jesus and Mary. They sang the Psalms in tones that have come down to us today in Gregorian chant. And then there was this video I found on YouTube. This gal, I'm going to say her name wrong, probably Suzanne Haik Ventura, and she was studying the markings above ancient psalm texts, and she suspected that they had pitch values. And there's been all kinds of speculation about what these markings were for, but that is, a very early form of notating before they actually came up with, the original modern notation, or,
Okay.
So she's like, she put pitch values to these markings and experimented until she was able to figure out a melody. And then she had a recording done of Psalm 19. You can find it on YouTube, and these guys singing it according to these markings. And it's like, oh yeah, that's chant. Like, I mean, it has a little, like a maybe more kind of ethnic. Well, I don't know. When I hear certain music, I'm like, that sounds Hebrew. Like, I don't know. I'm not a Jew, so what do I know? But I mean, I've heard enough that I'm just kind of like, oh yeah, like it has a certain kind of sound, or maybe it's the way they're singing it. But I'm like, that's totally chant. Like it's the same thing. And so I thought that was so cool that she did that. And yeah, there's been other things like Colin Shearing wrote a book about Gregorian chant, and in there he said, throughout the ancient history of the Jewish people, music and singing is mentioned with a frequency far exceeding its mention in the cultural history of any other people. And then there was a 13th century Italian Jewish poet, Manuelo La Romi, who wrote, What says our music to the Christians? Stolen, yea, stolen was I from the land of the Hebrews. And that's a quote from Genesis 40, verse 15. And I was like, oh, it's so cool. Like, there it is. It's all over the place. So yeah, you dig around, you'll find it.
Gosh, that is really fascinating. I didn't know that. Oh my gosh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
Just makes you appreciate our
Makes you want
heritage
to run
and
out and start chanting, huh?
yeah, essentially. Well, yeah, I know Dustin Quick, and I've read some of the source material that he's read, and it's amazing. It's true. It's not like Catholicism is not a new religion. It's the restoration of First Temple Judaism, really, and
Yeah.
so that makes sense. All that you just said, it makes a lot of sense. Um, and it's just that's so cool. I don't know who could hear that and not be pumped up about chant. Like, I
Yeah.
don't know. It's so cool. So obviously, nowadays, most of the masses are, at least as far as I'm aware, are at the Novus Ordo. So, do you think there is still merit to having Latin chant even during a Novus Ordo mass?
Yeah, and I think there always will be. I mean, Latin is always appropriate for the Roman Rite, and the chants and the texts in Latin still stand and are still considered the first and second options to use when choosing musical settings for the propers. I mean, in the Roman Missal, it'll always give you like four options for the places where the propers are sung in the mass, and it's like the Graduale Romanum, the Graduale Simplex, which is just a sort of a simpler version of the Romanum, and then it's like, or other psalms set to metrical settings, or other suitable chants. Well, actually, it says chants in every case. The previous version of the missal was translated. They translated cantus as song, but it's actually more accurate as chant. So now the current translation says chants everywhere, because that's really what they intended. Song has a totally
Okay.
different connotation. So that's
Sure.
kind of an aside. But the Missa Jubilate Deo was a compilation of simple chants for the ordinary of the Mass that Pope Paul VI put out in 1974 to all the bishops of the world. He's like, I want every Catholic to know this, at least these chants, so that no matter where they are, they can sing them together. And he
Mm,
wanted them to be standard, not like you couldn't use other things, but definitely used enough that people are likely to encounter them as they're moving around the globe, and always be able to pray together those chants. And those are all in Latin.
right.
And so that's still the repertoire, minimum repertoire of plain chant that the church desires every Catholic to know, and they make reference to that in different documents. And
Okay.
so,
Well.
yeah, for the greater part of our history as Catholics, chant has been sung in Latin, meaning that so far it's the most normative language for our liturgical singing. So even though it's perfectly appropriate also from a historical perspective as well to chant in our native tongues, and the Jews did, other rites in the church do, and the Orthodox and the Anglicans do. I mean, it's been traditional really all along, in pockets at least, to do that and maintain it. So it's all very beautiful and holy and uplifting, can be.
Mhm.
But the Latin chants have never been supplanted or deposed to a lower
Sure.
place. And there's something,
Right.
transcendent and special about hearing prayers and reflections sung or spoken in Latin. And it helps you enter that timeless realm, like we talked about, where the mystery of
Yeah.
God is before you, and yet another manifestation. So it's not necessary to the beauty or integrity of the Mass to retain Latin, but it's definitely worth preserving, making sure that people are familiar with it. So,
Yes.
yeah.
Right. That's a good point. Well, I think that it does help with the whole timeless feel because Latin is a dead language, right? And that works to its advantage, actually.
Yeah,
um,
right. It's
uh,
true. I mean, that's why they still write the official church documents in Latin, and then they make translations in each language from that, because the Latin won't change, the meaning won't change, but all the other languages that are in common use will develop, and their meanings
yeah.
will shift. And so then periodically they'll have to have retranslations,
Hmm.
but they always know what they're getting it from is the same. So,
Yeah, exactly. I think Chesterton said something like, "Because Latin has died, it's immortal." So
oh,
it's
that's funny.
just it's kind of paradoxical, but
Yeah.
yeah. So I think that's great that it hasn't been deposed, as you said, and
Yeah.
um, yeah, it gives us something to have in common anywhere in the world, which is really cool. Because I think a part of the mass that, like, I think we sometimes come to mass thinking about it as more of a, um, I don't know. I'm going there to be taught something, but it's like a big part of it too is going to participate. And
Yeah.
so even if you don't know what these Latin words mean, the fact that you can participate with everyone around you in this, in whatever you're doing, saying or chanting, that's powerful. And I think that that's something that, we shouldn't forget about.
Right. No, it's really true. Yeah, I mean, and the mass is meant to teach, but on more levels than one. I mean,
Yeah.
it's an experience that draws you in, and your soul is fed, and but you can understand truths without having them just told to you baldly. It's like reading
Yes.
kids fairy tales and stuff. I mean, they intuit the truths in those stories. You don't have to tell your kids after every story time, and the lesson of that was blah 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 blah. I mean, and you could be right, but you could also be missing stuff that they're just going to intuit without even being told, and they're just going to understand it. I mean, that's the point of those stories. It's to teach you things that you just drink in that story form, like Jesus used
Yeah.
parables and stuff, and the mass is a story and a
Yeah.
song and all these things. It's like, wow, on so many levels you're just getting soaked in it. So yeah, I mean, definitely. And you have the sermon or the homily, and that's all there. But
Right.
yeah, like Liturgiam Authenticam was a document they put out about the kind of the purpose of translating things into the vernacular and making that more common at mass. But they even said in there that the primary intention behind that was not for the sake of cognitive understanding, but for the sake of facilitating the participation of the faithful so that they could take more of an active role in the mass. So it's like,
Sure.
oh, okay. So the church isn't sitting around real worried that people are going to not understand everything. And she encourages,
Mhm.
the readings and the prayers that change from mass to mass to be done in the vernacular. So you can at least follow that, but you don't need everything else translated because you already know what it's saying, or you should.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, if you think about the early church, like if you were participating in the mass, that means that you were already a baptized Christian. Because if you
Mm,
weren't, you weren't going to be like
yeah.
witnessing the consecration of the Eucharist or anything.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
so you weren't. It wasn't like you were going to mass to get catechized, really. That
Yeah.
would, you know,
Mm,
and
yeah.
yeah, it's like you can look up, on Google or something, the answers to almost anything, but you can't look up on Google what it feels like to be in a sacred setting during, the
Mm,
consecration of the sacrament. Like that's something you just experience and you just
yeah.
yeah, it's all about experience and intuition. So I like that what you said. I
Oh,
think
that's a
there
really good point that you just made. Yeah, right. You can't just tell someone an experience or just read about it. It's yeah. Mhm.
yeah, like you can look up the words to that song that was in Latin or something if you want to, but um,
Yeah.
maybe the focus should be more on how can we make this as, reverent and as wonderful in the
Mhm.
true sense as possible. Um,
Yeah, right.
Seems like that's where the emphasis could be. Um,
Mhm.
so, for people who, like me, who are kind of new to sacred music, are there any composers or chant groups or
Hmm.
something that we could look up to get familiar with this?
Oh yeah. I mean, there's YouTube. There's all these if people are asking for like CDs, the Benedictines of Our Lady of Ephesus, they're in Gower, Missouri. They have a series of CDs for each season of the liturgical year, and they
Hmm.
have chant and polyphony, and they're beautiful. They do a wonderful job, and that's a really good introduction. It's just so peaceful to listen to, and yeah, you get a flavor from each season and how they're different. So that's a really good one. I mean, Gregorian chant in general, you kind of can't go wrong just looking that up. And the monks of Salem, they're kind of like the chant nerds of the whole world, and so whatever they put out
Yeah,
is good. Then there's also Ambrosian chant, which it's not Roman chant, so or Gregorian. I mean, that sort of is what's left from various smaller rites in their
okay.
own native forms of the chant that sort of survive to this day. So if you look up Ambrosian chant, you can kind of get a different sound, but it's still chant, so it's gorgeous, very purple.
Yeah.
St. Hildegard of Bingen composed Gregorian chants, and they have
Wow,
kind of a unique sound and style to them, but they're really cool, very,
that's cool.
very, yeah. So look up her; she was amazing, and yeah, she's a
Yeah.
doctor of the church now, and rightly
Yeah.
so. She like did everything.
Yeah.
And then when polyphony that's always like the second category of sacred music talked about in the documents as being most suitable to the liturgy after chant, which it actually developed from chant, which is so cool. That What Makes Music Sacred talk by Professor Mart, he explained like how, we had antiphonal singing where it's like your choir, it's like two choirs and they sing back and forth like one at a time. But then polyphony sort of developed from making it so that the parts could overlap at the same time and they would
Mm,
blend harmoniously. And then it's like, and then so you're still chanting because it's these individual lines of notes and melody, expressing the text, but it just flows together and it gets so rich when you have all these different parts, and so then that created a whole new genre of music. But the church still is like, polyphony is awesome. Like that's the next best thing you can get. And it grew right out of chant. And so, I mean, they consider Palestrina to be kind of the king of polyphonic composition, and Thomas Tallis, William Byrd, Claudio Monteverdi, Hoscan, and Cristobal Morales. Those are some other ones. Like you look up their stuff if you want to get a real taste for kind of the primo. And because really you just steep yourself in the best and it'll give you an ear to better discern the sacred from religious or,
mm,
profane music, because then you're grounding yourself in something that is like the church loves this music. The church has praised this music to the skies. Like, this is great. So I'm going to get
yeah.
stuck in that and then pray for the grace to know the difference, because that's the best thing you can do as far as learning to discern and appreciate those things. So that's where I would recommend you start.
Yeah, that's wow, amazing. So you mentioned Ambrosian and obviously Gregorian, but I've also heard Dominican chant, I guess. Is that a thing? Is that something separate?
They do, because they have their own rite within their
Okay.
order. I don't know very much about that, but yeah, I do know that they have some particular, and they have their own feasts and stuff too that they, will observe even in addition to the rest of the calendar and stuff. So then, and every feast
Hmm.
has its own propers and things, and the Benedictines do too. And they're the
Okay.
ones that put out the Graduale Romanum, that official chant book for the propers. And so like in the back, they have the calendar, with all the proper saints, with all the propers for the different feast days. And then they have like this extra one that's like Benedictine saints and their propers. And you're like, oh, you just stuck that in there, didn't you? Like,
Hmm.
that's nice. But yeah, no, it's like there's just these little pockets everywhere of more, But yeah, you're right. There's definitely more out there than what I mentioned. I'm still learning.
Yeah, but you mentioned so much good stuff. Yeah, I was just trying to think where else to go, and one of the things I was thinking of is in that first long quote that you read off, you mentioned something about how like it's not about you, artist. Like it's about what did you say? It's about our end, our
Yeah.
goal,
Like,
our destination.
mhm. Yeah.
Um, and to go back to like the comparison with religious or sacred art and iconography, I think about the fact that within in the East you actually have like canons for iconography. You have to do it in a certain way, and that's why they call it writing an icon, not painting an icon, right? Because there's a
Oh,
grammar
yeah.
and a whole syntax to it, which is awesome. And
Yeah.
so there's room for like a fresh expression of the individual artist, but it has to be it has to be with continuity with the
Hmm.
past. And so if you look at some of the more contemporary but still really good quality modern icons, you can see that they're modern, but yet
Yeah.
they retain that ancient sort of feel to them.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, it's like it's not like the church is saying that we can't have religious music or that
Hmm.
religious music is worse. It's more just the fact, like you said, everything in its right place, right?
Hmm.
Um,
Right. We just haven't really, I think we kind of got lazy, especially after the reforms of Vatican II, where it was like, um, anything goes liturgically. And you like this, shove it into the mass, oh, let's just kind of squish everything in here and all get comfortable together. And it's like, well, so now I think what that did is it kind of impoverished other devotional practices like Eucharistic processions, or rosary events, or,
mhm,
it's like parish sing-alongs should totally be a thing, like seasonal, times when outside of mass you get together and you just play all these hymns and things that everybody loves to sing, and you
Right.
just sing them together. They're religious. I mean, it's appropriate to have them in church, but you're not doing it within the context of mass.
Yeah.
And Pope Pius XII's encyclical Musicae Sacrae, he did a good job talking about hymns and why hymns are so great and important and valuable. But he always talks about them in a context other than liturgical. Like
Yeah.
he makes a distinction that it's like they're wonderful. Use them for devotional practices. Use them, sing them whenever you want. Sing them, but they definitely stand apart from liturgical music. So we gotta, I
Right.
think, maybe recreate that niche where those things can have more use and expression and be
Right.
enjoyed by people, because it does bring you together, and it, takes you back to the old days. You're growing up, and the things that inspired you or helped you to pray. Like, it's not that they don't have value. It's just, are they worthy enough for the temple? And
Hmm.
that's where it's just, yeah, we're not trying to rob anybody, but we need to create opportunities where people can enjoy those things in a legitimate way and not feel like they've got to have everything they like in the mass, because
Yeah.
there isn't room.
Well, if we all try and have what we like in the masses, we all like different things, so that's going to be a little bit difficult.
Right. It's true. Yeah, you can't make everybody happy, and the more
Yeah.
tastes you're trying to appease, the more you're going to fail, because you'll turn some people way off and other people, you'll make happy. But it's like, oh, and then everybody's like, I mean, it's so interesting how often you hear people talking about, their difficult experiences at mass at this or that church, and how much of it revolves around the music. You're like,
Mm.
wow. But it's very impacting, and it can kind of,
Yeah.
like, it doesn't break the liturgy to have bad music, but that expression, make it or break it, it's like, you've really impoverished it if you didn't give it everything there was to give. Even if your skill is minimal, you can still do simple things that are dignified. And, the church says that the human voice alone is totally dignified and
Yeah.
worthy enough to accompany even the most solemn liturgical celebrations. It's never been necessary to have accompaniment. That's kind
Oh,
of
yeah.
like, it's permitted, but it's an add-on. Basically, it's like the human voice is it.
Yes, we went to a Candlemas mass. Well, the last time there was Candlemas, whenever that was, and
Yeah.
it was just one girl, one lady singing during the mass, and that was it. But it was one of the most beautiful masses I've been to, and there
Oh,
is something powerful just about a voice, a human voice. And
right.
absolutely, I'm totally with you. I think music, it's so important, and it can make it or break it sort of for people, at least in terms of their experience of the mass. Like you said, it's not like the sacrament is invalid and all that, but it
Yeah.
doesn't technically break the liturgy, but it can really hurt people, their experience. So it's super important. And
Mhm.
then you talked about having religious music outside of the mass, but still in a religious context, a communal context. And
Mhm.
it reminds me of, trying to remember who it was. It was one of my friends. They were talking about um, like a Spanish mass or a mass in a
Mm.
Hispanic area, maybe, that they went to on I think it was the feast day of Our Lady of Guadalupe, maybe. But anyways, after the mass, they had like mariachi music in the parking lot outside, and
Oh,
to celebrate. And that's
it's
awesome.
yeah,
It
right,
it's it brings people together. It's like they're celebrating Our Lady of Guadalupe, but it
right,
happened in its proper place outside of the mass. And so
right.
I just think if we can keep that in mind, it's not like we're trying to squash other forms of
Yeah,
artistic expression or
right,
devotion.
right.
Um,
Yeah, the church, she's ready to acknowledge the good everywhere, but always with that understanding that there's certain principles that make it fit or unfit for mass.
right.
And so, but that we don't really talk about it very much. So most people just have never even heard that concept. And that's one thing I realized when I was going around at the parishes and doing my chant workshops was, I in the beginning, I didn't even have a component where we would just talk about what is sacred and what isn't,
Yeah.
and why does it even matter? Because I would just plow in and I'd get into all this stuff, and I'd start talking about church documents and the church's vision for the liturgy and the music, and people are just kind of looking at me like, "But what about this? Well, I don't get it." And I'm like, "Oh." Because, like you said, the sense of the sacred has been so lost. It's like, whoa, okay, before we start anything else, we got to talk
Yeah.
about this, because
Gotta
it's
back
such a
up.
new idea for people. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's so true. Um, yeah. So one thing before I go to my last question, which was the mass being sort of the same or like having a continuity with in terms of the music and in terms of the architecture and iconography, like the fact that icons now look similar to the icons 2000 years ago and all that, and just this whole sense of entering into this timeless space.
Mhm.
um, the way I think about it and the way I try to explain it sometimes is like a wheel. You know how a wheel, the further out towards the rim, I guess, the faster it spins.
Oh yeah. Mhm.
And the closer you get to the center, the slower it spins until you reach the point that is the absolute center, which is actually technically it doesn't exist, but it's not moving at all. And it's like Christ is the center, Christ in the Eucharist. It's even round, so it looks like a wheel. Like
Oh,
it's the
yeah.
center of everything, right? And
Mhm.
so it makes sense that our lives are so busy and hectic and crazy, and we're busy with work and getting kids to daycare and all this stuff, and it's like the mass is a place where you can go and you kind of know what to expect, but it's like a comforting thing. It's like
Mhm.
it brings you peace, I guess, to
Yeah.
know what's going to be there for you when you come.
Yeah.
And
It shouldn't be like that. Definitely.
it doesn't need to be like an entertaining it doesn't need to be like a concert. Well, because that brings me to my last question, which is for people like me who come from a Protestant background.
Mhm.
At first, we come to a mass thinking like, okay, this is the Catholic version of a worship service. It's like the
Mhm.
same thing, but with icons or something.
Yeah.
But there is a fundamental difference, right, between a praise and worship
Mhm.
uh, night and the mass. You know,
Right.
maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Ooh, praise and worship. Well, I mean, the Protestant tradition of worship and their idea of that, it grew out of, I mean, a lot of Catholic ideas and practices, but because they split away, they started kind of developing on their own track, and then they didn't. One thing that's really significant is they didn't have mass. Okay, so they didn't have the parts of the mass and those congregational parts like the priest and the people's responses and the ordinaries like the Kyrie and the Gloria and the Sanctus, and like they started missing more and more of that. So they're like, well, we still want to sing, so what are we going to sing? So a lot of the great hymns that are out there today, I mean, most of them were composed by Protestants.
Yeah,
And so, yeah, we use them in Catholic churches too now because we're like, hey, these are good. I mean, and some of them are dignified enough for the liturgy, some of them aren't.
right,
But yeah, that's that hymn, the tradition of hymnody specifically, and then it kind of that developed more into more trendy styles because it started to just sort of shift and change with the time because they didn't have that same emphasis on preserving the three necessary qualities for sacred music that the church has always kind of drilled, like we gotta keep our sights fixed on this, and the Protestants were just a little more like loose because they didn't have that magisterium and stuff. So yeah, I mean, hymnody, that's something a lot of Catholics have come to just expect. That's how it should
hmm,
be at Mass. But it's like, that's actually mostly a Protestant tradition. Hymns
right,
were used in the Catholic tradition, but they were used in the divine office. And that continues to this day. That's where hymns happened. And
right,
Mass, you had so much other singing
yeah,
besides, you didn't need hymns. Now, if you go to a Mass where everything's sung that could be sung of the Mass itself, and then you stick hymns in there too, you're like, it's exhausting. You get to the end of it and you're like, oh my gosh, I made it. Like, that was a lot of singing because you don't need that much. The people already had parts, the choir had parts, the priest had parts, it was all assigned, but the Protestants kind of lost the benefit of that. So yeah, it's trying to, like, now we forget that,
right,
and then we try to kind of bring them together. And another thing that confused that was the the liturgical um missal of 1962 that pre the reforms of Vatican II.
hmm,
That had, the low mass and the high mass. And the low mass was spoken. That was really intended to be the priest's private mass that he would
right,
say. It wasn't like people could attend, but it was never meant to be any kind of like regular thing that you would have a congregation with you. You'd have a server to represent a congregation because
okay,
the church should always be present, at mass. But then it's like, there are times of persecution, especially in Ireland, where
Hmm.
they couldn't be doing sung masses. They didn't have the resources, or they had to be like hiding out. So they're doing
Right.
spoken ones all the time for, hundreds of years to hide out and preserve their faith. And then so many of those Irish priests came and evangelized the New World. And here we are then with this tradition that carries over of low masses is kind of the norm. Like you did see high masses and sung masses, but it came to be more of an unusual thing. And then so when people go to Latin Mass, so they talk about, oh, I go to the traditional Latin Mass or whatever, and a lot of the time they're talking about just a low Mass, and that's what you find around today a lot of times when you stumble on a 1962 missal Mass. And that they allowed hymns to be sung at those low masses if they were celebrated with the congregation, so there could be some music to kind of give it a little more dignity and beauty if that's all the priest was able to do at the time. But it
Yeah.
was kind of a concession, and the hymns were not part of the liturgy. They were just sung over top. It was just totally understood as this accompaniment kind of thing. And then
Right.
that's where you get the four hymn sandwich thing. It's like entrance, offertory, communion, and recession, because that was what they did at the low mass. And
Right.
yeah, so that came to be standard for a lot of, especially American Catholics, church experience. But that is never what the church wanted to
Yeah.
be the standard experience. And so the reforms after Vatican II, they actually made it a lot easier to do a sung liturgy, because they were so strict before that if you didn't have so many servers, incense or this, all these things, and every single thing had to be sung except the canon, because that was always silent. But it's like, whoa, that's a lot. Now the church allows it in degrees. There's 3 degrees of what should be sung. It's like if you can have the
Okay.
first one, great, and then it still constitutes a sung mass, and then you can add on the 2nd degree if you've got that one, and then you can add on the 3rd degree. But it's way easier to make that more of a common experience for Catholics. And
Hmm.
so yeah, that
I
was
would.
really, sorry.
Yeah. No, that's great. I didn't know that until just recently watching your videos, and that was so interesting to me. And so again, I just want to refer people to Laura's channel and her your series called Sacred Music and Gregorian Chant. Is that what it's called?
Yeah,
Something
for
like that.
beginners, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really good. So I think, did we talk about the 3 principles?
No, we didn't yet. I was going to ask if you wanted me to read them before the end.
Okay, sure. Could we go over those? That would be
Yeah,
great.
absolutely. I'll just read from Tra le Sollecitudini, which is that 1903 encyclical of Pius the Fifth, Pius the Tenth. Sorry, there's so many Piuses. Anyway, so right near the beginning, he talks about general principles of sacred music, and he begins: sacred music, being a complementary part of the psalm liturgy, participates in the general scope of the liturgy, which is the glory of God and the sanctification and edification of the faithful. It contributes to the decorum and the splendor of the ecclesiastical ceremonies, and since its principal office is to clothe with suitable melody the liturgical text proposed for the understanding of the faithful, its proper aim is to add greater efficacy to the text, in order that through it the faithful may be the more easily moved to devotion and better disposed for the reception of the fruits of grace belonging to the celebration of the most holy mysteries. Sacred music should consequently possess, in the highest degree, the qualities proper to the liturgy, and in particular, sanctity and goodness of form, which will spontaneously produce the final quality of universality.
Mm,
So then he goes to explain those. It must be holy and must therefore exclude all profanity, not only in itself, but in the manner in which it is presented by those who execute it. It must be true art, for otherwise it will be impossible for it to exercise on the minds of those who listen to it that efficacy which the church aims at obtaining and admitting into her liturgy the art of musical sounds. But it must at the same time be universal, in the sense that while every nation is permitted to admit into its ecclesiastical compositions those special forms which may be said to constitute its native music, still these forms must be subordinated in such a manner to the general characteristics of sacred music that nobody of any nation may receive an impression other than good on hearing them. And then he talks about Gregorian chant has always been regarded as the supreme model for sacred music. So it's fully legitimate to lay down the following rule: the more closely a composition for church approaches in its movement, inspiration, and savor the Gregorian form, the more sacred and liturgical it becomes. And the more out of harmony it is with that supreme model, the less worthy it is of the temple. So that's from Pius X. And then John Paul II added this in 2003. He said, "It is not, of course, a question of imitating Gregorian chant, but rather of ensuring that new compositions are imbued with the same spirit that inspired and little by little came to shape it. Only an artist who is profoundly steeped in the sensus ecclesiae can attempt to perceive and express in melody the truth of the mystery that is celebrated in the liturgy." And there you have that again. The artist has to be steeped in this, in what the church desires, and in this really spiritual life, in order to be able to bring this out for other people. You can't just come walking in cold, not knowing anything, or having any formation. I mean, not like you can't add anything, but it's definitely not gonna, it's gonna fall short probably of what it should be. One thing I wanted to just add was, so we have number one's holy and sacred music, and true art and goodness of form is the second one, and then universality, which it's universally recognized as good and beautiful, universally binding and incorporating, and universally usable and appropriate. And so that's something that can be said of chant. It can really be used all over the world. And they talk, and I think Sing to the Lord 2007, that was a U.S. bishop's document talking about sacred music. They talked about the chant is uniquely the church's own music, deserves a pride of place. And it said it's a living connection with our forebears in the faith, the traditional music of the Roman Rite, a sign of communion with the universal church, a bond of unity across cultures, a means for diverse communities to participate together in song, and a summons to contemplative participation in the liturgy. So with all this stuff about ethnic music, or incorporating these things, it's like, yes, you can definitely incorporate ethnic forms a lot more easily with religious music. With sacred music, though, chant is so universal. It encompasses all of those cultures and diversities. So it should be binding us together no matter what. It's not like, well, that just came from Rome, so it's not going to do any good in Africa or something. Like, it's meant to be everyone's music, and it really can be.
It can be. Yeah, that's really helpful, those three principles: sanctity, goodness of form, universality. Yeah, especially that third one is like a key, I think, because you could argue that certain forms of religious music are, good, and they have a goodness of form, but they're not going to be universal, probably.
And Pope Pius X saying that anybody from any nation should derive nothing but good on hearing them, or receive no other impression than good on hearing them. It's like, oh yeah, you kind of think about some of those songs that you grew up with, or it's like, that's gonna definitely sound 80s, or it's too dated, it's too something from the end of a movie soundtrack or something. It's like, it sounds nice, but is that evoking the sacred, and would everybody across the world hear that and be like, oh yeah? And no, it's not. I mean, really, you can weed out a lot of stuff using that criteria.
Just right there. Yeah. In all times and places, would this work? No? Okay, then we probably shouldn't use it. Yeah. A lot of
I just love that. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, that one excerpt from Bishop Olmsted's talk where he said, religious music comes from human hearts yearning for God, and sacred music comes from Christ's heart, the heart of the church yearning for us. It's like, whoa, that one says a lot.
Yeah, I missed that. Yeah. Gosh. Yeah. Please send me these links.
Okay. Sure.
Definitely going to put these in the description. Yeah. I think that's a pretty good place to end it for today. You gave us a lot of really great information, and I'm looking forward to listening back through this and just picking up on all the things I missed the first time around, because that was a lot of really good stuff. So
good. Well, I'm glad. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you want to add, or anywhere that you would like to direct, the viewers?
Well, I mean, yeah, you already mentioned the series on Gregorian chant for beginners on my channel. That's the place to start. And I mentioned Professor William Martz, his talks, and the CMAA has a website called musicasacra.com, and they have a forum there which you can go find an answer to almost any question you have about history and liturgy and music, and its practical application stuff, because there's people from all over the world that help out on that forum, and it's been going for years and years. So they have tons of resources, like a lot of free things too. that you can download and access, and recommendations for things on their site. It is just like, it's the best sacred music resource I know of, just singly to send people to. So musicasacra.com, and then any of their colloquiums or their sacred music workshops. It's a life-changing experience going to those. Like, it will definitely empower you. Everybody likes that word, don't they?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's, they're great. They do those, the sacred music colloquiums are a week long. They do them every summer.
Okay.
And so I mean,
That sounds
there's
awesome.
like a cost to attend, okay, but it's worth every cent. And you'll meet amazing people. You'll just go home jam full of ideas and like stuff you never knew you didn't know. And just, it's so exciting. I mean, sacred music is, and it's a very positive environment. Like, there's so many people in this effort that are just, they just love God so much, and they're doing it because of that. It's very enriching and enlivening. It's not like we all just sit around and, chew on, this piece of music we don't like or whatever. I mean, it's, it's really good. So yeah, I would just say, and go listen to sacred music and have fun. Oh, another composer I didn't mention yet, Kevin Allen. He's a modern composer that does some really nice polyphonic settings, like for 3 and 4 voices. He has these books of different motets, and they're really pretty easy to learn, and they're really beautiful. And so you can find recordings of his stuff. And if you want, something newer for your choir to learn, they're short and really beautiful. So that's a good one too.
Great. Well, everyone, check out Laura's channel, Miss Happy Catholic. Laura, thank you so much for talking with me today. And
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael. God bless you and your work.
Thank you. And you as well.
Thanks.
All right. Bye-bye.